Hi everyone, I'm Todd Fisher, the host of the Cult Following podcast. Cult Following is a podcast that studies the personalities and common traits of cult leaders and their followers. Get the real story behind these infamous and oftentimes tragic cults from a new perspective through exhaustive research and from interviews with people that were there. Available anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of No Earthly Explanation with your host, Brittany Barbieri, and my partner in crime, Donald Schmidt. Tonight, we have an incredible show for you. Our guest tonight, because we will be getting right into it, is Dacre Stoker. He is the great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker, and we're just going to dive right into this because I'm sure he's got a lot of really cool things from his research and investigation into his family history that he would love to share, and as far as his own personal journeys. So with that being said, welcome to the show. We are so wonderful to have you.
Well, thank you, Brit and Donald, for having me. This is great. A very appropriately named podcast, No Earthly Explanation, sums up Dracula and the success that the novel that my great-granduncle wrote 126 years ago. I mean, it's the gift that keeps on giving, doesn't it? It is established an incredible horror genre, all kinds of subcultures along the way. It is, the name Dracula is just known all over the world, and it's burned, from stage to film to streaming, Halloween costumes, toys, everything in between. So it's very cool that I'm here as the family spokesman. I'm the one in the family that has sort of put himself forward to dig into Bram's life and to share with your listeners and readers worldwide, some of the cool things about Bram Stoker's life, some of the research that I now know he did, where he got some of his sources. So yeah, Britt, let's jump into this and fire away so we can enlighten some of your listeners about the mysteries behind the writing of Dracula.
Well, we're both, not only very flattered, but extremely looking forward to the next 45 minutes or so, because as you mentioned, you are the family historian. You've taken all the time to actually, look into not only the folklore, but the origins and what essentially were the behind the scenes instigations and inspirations that then has personified itself as far as this one individual, this one character that is not only worldwide in that one impression that everyone has when they hear the word vampire or Dracula. But I have to ask you, again, as you said, it's the story that keeps giving. And I'm sure there's no end to the theatrical and the feature representations of the character. Are you consulted? I mean, do they hire you on set to come on and as far as and provide inside information that may not be available, like on Wikipedia or elsewhere?
Well, that's a good question. I wish I was consulted more often, but the answer, yes, occasionally I am, and it's mostly on television and streaming productions. Mm-hmm. I have not been asked to contribute to anything that Hollywood has put out in the form of a feature film, and that's pretty much because Hollywood is kind of a closed world, as you guys well know. Even as an author who a prequel I wrote to Dracula with J.D. Barker, Dracul, the option was sold to Paramount, but as our agent said, yeah, that's the last you'll see of them. Oh. If they do pick up the option, they'll get a screenwriter, and you might get invited, to the red carpet. But forget anything else. But when it comes to television, they're always sort of looking for, hey, let's have a spot appearance on an episode where we're looking into either Vlad Dracula or places in Transylvania or in England, or looking at the whole myth of the vampire in general. What was Bram Stoker's involvement? So I have been involved on 4 or 5 of these things, and sometimes it's just a phone call, like fact checking, give a little direction, but other times it is pretty cool gigs to get actually hired to go somewhere and be on the screen talking with the host about things, about Bram's research and how it's germane to the topic that they're discussing on the show.
Just as a quick follow-up, are there any particular documentaries or programs that you would recommend that you felt, were the most accurate and the most truthful in their portrayal of your?
Yes, because there are a lot of them out there that I cringe at when they're just sort of, and look, we all know sensationalism sells, right? It gets clicks and so on, and it's the same thing on the internet and everything else. And so I realize that you've got to be a bit sensational to get the attention of the viewers, to get the advertisers on board. But at the same time, there's plenty of time to tell the right story. So there was ended up being picked up by PBS called Secrets of the Dead, was the series, and they did one episode on the vampire legend. Yes, Secrets of the Dead. It's great. They've got many episodes, but Vampire Legend was one in particular that they looked at it from both an academic and historical perspective, as well as, sort of, as I say, the fans' perspective. And they balanced things, like the way people pick up in New Orleans and LA, a bit of the lifestyle with where did its stuff really come from. Another one that I thought was really interesting and done very recently by Fox on the streaming part of Fox Nation, they looked specifically at the American vampire. And we've all learned about things going on in Serbia and Poland and Transylvania, but this was specifically a focus on the American vampire, which of course Bram Stoker was very well aware of. One of the really cool pages of notes in his 125 pages of notes that sit in the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia was a clipping from the New York World newspaper from 1896. So that was still while he was writing Dracula, because he wrote it between 1890 and 97. He was over in America as the theater manager on tour with Henry Irving. And just by some luck, he came across this newspaper article about the New England vampire scare, and he cut it out and stuck it into his notebook. And it was actually used for writing the novel, because there's a specific piece in there where they reference, and this goes back to history, guys, that Charles Darwin had just recently published The Origin of the Species, which kind of rocked the religious world on its behind. But he also mentioned in that the discovery of the vampire bat in South America. And so what Bram did was he took that discovery of the vampire bat that Darwin mentioned, and he used that in the dialogue in the novel when Van Helsing is trying to explain to the band of heroes, like, look, this is what a vampire may be. And Quincy Morris says, yes, when I was in South America, almost word for word, as Charles Darwin said, we saw these big bats come out of the trees and drink the blood out of my horse. So much so I had to put it down. Now that was the poetic license that Bram twisted that. What I'm thrilled is that Bram found a contemporary vampire account that he could then insert into his somewhat fictional novel, and that's the basis for what Fox did with exploring the American vampire. And of course, there's many more: Mercy Brown, Sarah Tillinghast, and many others in New England. So those are two of my favorites that I think are entertaining, but also quite factual.
So the Fox Nation one, quickly, Brit, before I let you come in. Was it something that they researched on their own, or did you lead them? Did you present this to them as a storyline?
The producer already had a bit of an idea. She contacted a few people, and one of those people turned them on to me, and it became sort of this momentum builder. I said, oh, well, I know some other guys who I've done my research or read their books. You should contact him and her and so on. and this is kind of Don, how things go when
Yes,
you're
yes.
interested that they have some success. You want to be involved in a show that tells the right story, so you want to connect them to the right people.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so I think I don't want to take credit for it. It was not the Genesis idea that I had. I played a small part in connecting them with other folks that know a lot. And I think they ended up with maybe 7 or 8, as we say, talking heads, experts that were able to help this producer put her story together and use all of us, to sort of tell the story. And then they had this host, Emily, who was wonderful, and she was well schooled and well read on the subject. So sometimes hosts just are the sound piece, but she was good questions, well read. So between her and the producer, that ended up, I think, making the story really good and special.
We will definitely check that, but you still orchestrated it. You still steered them in the right directions. I mean, they could have gone off on tangents and, had some fluff individuals. I mean, you saved their research people a lot of time and effort.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I helped direct them. No, you're right. And I didn't have power of veto, but I definitely did help put them in a direction. But I'm not the only one, because it's a community. I meet some of these people at conferences, some virtual, and nowadays we're getting back to, big conferences where you can sit and have breakfast or dinner with some of these colleagues. And it's really nice because you learn who's got the good things to say, who's found new research, and you want to help tell the story right. So yeah, I played a small part in that, and I'm proud of it, and hopefully it's got picked up some good reviews.
So, my question to follow up is that, as you talked about finding a contemporary vampire case in the US standpoint, and like you mentioned, yeah, there's plenty of cases overseas. We know that. But has your journey and your research in recent years taking you to the US with the modernized style of vampire versus how it was written from, your great uncle? I mean, I'm curious on how that has transitioned for you doing the research that you've come from.
Yeah, it's been a journey, Brit. It's been 12 years, and I sort of started off, a bit of a capsule because, I was an athlete, as a coach, really didn't sort of live on the dark side, even though I'm related to Bram Stoker as my great granduncle. But I was, I read Stephen King and Anne Rice, and, I thought this was pretty cool. And I'd watch the odd movie when they'd come out, but I wasn't, really fixated on these things. And then I started doing the research because I figured somebody in the family really needs to stay up to date with all the things. And it's not just Bram's Dracula, it's other things as well. But I sort of got on this trail, which really was triggered by a fellow, Ian Holt, who asked me to start writing a sequel to Dracula with him. And that's really what got me going. And that took me to places, Brit, that I mean, I would have gone to Dublin, Ireland, because that's where the family came from, but I probably wouldn't have been to Trinity Library, Marsh's Library. I probably wouldn't have gone to Philadelphia's Rosenbach Museum. I probably wouldn't have gone out to Seattle, to where Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft, owns the Dracula typescript. I probably wouldn't have gone to Transylvania to climb mountains and look for the site of the fictional castle. But I've also been invited to speak at conferences in places like New Orleans, where there's not necessarily a treasure trove of Bram's material, but there is a subculture of people of let's call it dark magic, black magic, voodoo, and vampirism, people that practice modern day vampirism, which is not, dragging somebody into an alley and ripping their head off and drinking their blood involuntarily. There are people that, in a very voluntary manner, feel that they need small quantities, and I mean small, a thimbleful of blood from some of their friends or some of their people they're having relationships with, because they feel that modern medicine doesn't necessarily, solve all their problems. So my eyes have been open to these things, and I respect, alternate lifestyles and so on. And this was something that, again, didn't threaten me at all. And I thought, this is interesting. They're not just out there as fanboys and girls modeling themselves after Bram. There is a golf culture all over the world, people that like to live in the dark and wear black clothes and all kinds of cool, tattoos and piercings and so on, and that's their thing, and that's cool. And there's also people that do share blood. So that goes on all over the place. And I've seen people, and I've met a professor who is well schooled in this. He's used some of their lifestyle as their or his basis for his master's, his doctoral thesis. And I said, well, I'd like to meet some folks and chat with them. And he said, Dacre, you're sitting amongst them right now. You know, you can't really look at somebody. It's not like they walk around with fangs all the time.
Right.
But there are people that do dress up like that because they want to celebrate that dark side and think that that's cool, and all the power to them. So I have seen a lot of that, and it's great, because I think, you know, everybody, whatever, you know, makes them comfortable, whatever they identify with is fine. And you know, in a selfish way, as long as it doesn't threaten me or put me in a weird position, I'm cool. Right. You know, I have been solicited, you know, and I won't say who or where, but it was like, oh, I'd love some of that Stoker blood, you know, that'd be so cool if you could, you know, that would be high test, you know. And I go, well, yeah, I know, but I'm not really into that just now. Buy one of my books instead.
You're wise. You're wise.
Yeah.
Well, like the reason why I circle back to that real quick is the reason why I brought that up is because I'm familiar in Salem how they have every year the big vampire ball, to where it is a huge draw for this culture and this. So I was curious of where your journey has taken you, if you had been there or if you had seen and been introduced to that as well through your research, because it's truly fascinating, as you mentioned. It's a whole subculture. Yeah, it is.
And that vampire ball you're talking about, Father Sebastian, who is the famous Father Sebastian, who has a coven of people, and he's a licensed dental guy. I don't know what you call them, but is able to create custom fangs for folks. He does these balls around the world. And I was just in LA a couple of months ago doing one of my tours and speaking and presentations and book signings. And he said, would it be really cool if you come to the LA Vampire Ball? And I said, oh man, that's great. But, you know, it was on a night that I literally had to be flying home that night. I had family obligations. And I said, look, put me on the list. And apparently he does this in Salem, obviously every fall for obvious reasons. You know, witches, warlocks, and vampires seem to get along well in Salem. Maybe not in movies, but in Salem they do. And he's going to do them in, I think, either Tampa or Orlando. He's got plans for that. LA, they do it. And of course, New Orleans. So that gathering, I have been to one of the Anne Rice Vampire Lestat balls, which is very, very similar, Brit, to this, where, you know, people really get dressed up. The music is cool, and the ambiance is great. You really feel like you step back in time 500 years, and yeah, it's neat, and it's a dark celebration of that lifestyle.
And speaking of even how the world even perceives, you know, that dark, you know, that sinister, almost evilness as far as in the very character, and your own origins, the family being in Ireland, that rich in folklore, rich as far as in even the spiritual, the religious distinction between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, that type of thing. And so, and Bram was into all that. He was, you know, absorbing like a sponge so much of that, which then what captivated him, what actually, you know, inspired him to make that leap, to actually create a you know, a persona, a character that rose above all of that. And yet, you know, one can look at the dark side, but also there's the romanticism of Dracula, the whole idea of being a count, you know, because you can also think like the Count de Monte Cristo. I mean, it's a very positive, there's nothing negative about being a count, that type of thing. And so,
well, you've touched on, I mean, really, you've got the central nerve here, okay, and you've actually done a couple things that I'm so glad you did. But let's start with sort of the religion versus paganism that Bram Stoker grew up in Ireland. So in Ireland, as everybody knows, the Catholics and the Protestants have been going at it for 500 years. And Bram was right there. I mean, he was a Protestant, but he was living at a time when there was just ongoing sort of tension and battles and so on. But it was also, he was born in 1847, and near the end of that Victorian era, some scholars refer to it sort of as a new renaissance, like another awakening, really, of thought, where science and scholarly endeavor were unleashed yet again, and the power of organized religion was kind of getting pushed aside, because people now were more educated, they had science on their side, and were beginning to wonder, have questions answered more than just, well, it's God's will, contagious diseases and so on. They wanted answers, and now they've got the ability because of science and so on. And so many of these people were actually sort of forced to go non-mainstream, and this is what started things like Freemasonry, Order of the Golden Dawn, Hellfire Club, so that these free thinkers could discuss things like the occult, mesmerism, all these things in secret societies. And with that came devil worship, or interest in the devil. It wasn't necessarily a bunch of people slitting the throats of cats on Friday the 13th, but it was, there's got to be something else there. Is there no other explanation than when our body dies, what happens to the soul? Does it live on? Are ghosts a thing? And I tell people in my presentations, I think how popular paranormal investigation is to this day. Think how much more interesting it was back in the day when it was originating. The whole spiritualist movement was, hey guys, even though religion is telling us this, people were really interested. This is Arthur Conan Doyle. This is Houdini. These are seance, tarot card readings. All this stuff was in Bram's sphere. His friends, people interested in all this. And this is where, this is where I'll cut to answer your question, because it was a big one. Bram became fixated on the power of the devil. And that's how he then identified with his character of Dracula. Now, he took that out of a book, actually two books, one by William Wilkinson and one by James Samuelson. One book was in Whitby, where he took a holiday, the other in London. I've seen both the books, and they got things underlined, but it's mentioning the name Dracula, meaning devil, in Wallachia, which was a province right next to Transylvania. And of course, you read a little further, and he's focusing on Vlad the Impaler, who is nicknamed as the devil or the dragon. So he was trying to create this occult style story, but one that was really very realistic. And so he attached this count, as you mentioned, this aristocratic count, to somebody who wasn't necessarily super aristocratic, but had a really appropriate backstory and an appropriate history in the region where they had vampirism as a very well-known myth. So the supernatural was fertile territory in Transylvania, thanks to another book that Bram read by a Scottish writer called Emily Gerard, who wrote Transylvanian Superstitions and listed all the things that Bram needed to insert into the novel. And these other two books that he got, Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Dracula. So Bram was a master of combining different things from different books to make his story seem real. And that's the short version, guys, of sort of touching on the nerve of what people were thinking of at the time and attaching real people to his story. And then, of course, he placed it in real time. It was set in 1893. The book came out in 1897. And it occurred in Whitby, in London, in all these places, just on the heels of Jack the Ripper, which were scaring the heck out of people because the police couldn't stop the Ripper. And now you got a supernatural / natural guy that comes into town and starts killing people and converting them.
And with Jack the Ripper, you were talking about an historic figure and a genuine, as far as serial killer. And so I'm sure that only played up the notion, almost like someone who is a bit superhuman in that they're beyond apprehension. And yet they seem to have this overwhelming power over people to draw them in, to lure them into their clutches. And we know what the typical outcome is.
Yep.
So.
No, and that's it, because Bram was the theater manager when he was doing all his writing. So he knew what people were scared of, sensitive about. He knew how to put bums in seats, as they say. So he knew the sensitivities of his readers, of his viewers, and that
play up the paranoia. Yeah.
Exactly. He knew how to play it up and make it seem real.
Mm-hmm.
So would you say that you come more from the analytical or the creative side from your ancestry line of having that coming down and through your history? For you, are you creative in the sense of having that imagination and growing up with that folklore and that history? I'm sure from your Irish history. I mean, I have Irish descent as well. So it's interesting for me. That's that folklore and the belief was very embedded in our childhood home. And having that creative of option of your mind expanding into another realm outside of reality or combining them both. So where did your journey take you through all of this? And for you personally, do you see yourself more open creatively, or, where do you place yourself?
Brit, you're the first person that's ever asked that. And I appreciate it, because I haven't thought about it too much. But as I get to know Bram more, and I've found different things that he's written, his journal and so on, I think I'm an awful lot like Bram, and I'm not copping out by saying this, I think it's totally 50-50. You see, there is that school teacher coach in me that has to keep everything, very well organized, all the outlines. And once I attain that, then I can unleash that creative side and really start being the dreamer and going on about, okay, I read this and this is cool, and how could this really be, and what if it, as you know, that what if question. So Bram himself was that kind of a guy. He was a member of the Philosophical Society, the Historical Society at Trinity College, but he was also a clerk in the Petty Sessions Legal Department that wrote a legal manual that was super organized and basically organized the Irish court system between 1879 and 1960. But then he also would read all these books, and I believe Brit was very affected by the stories his mother told him as a young boy about Irish folklore, mythology. And so your listeners get this. Irish folklore and mythology is not like leprechauns and Tinkerbell. These are bloodsuckers, these are life takers, these are cautionary tales from all angles. And even a book that Bram had in his personal library by Oscar Wilde's mother mentioned that Irish folklore is very similar to Transylvanian folklore involving vampires, just named different things. So I'm glad that you asked that, but I think we're on the same wavelength with that. Yeah.
I'm learning a lot during this show, and I love that.
Yeah.
The whole, I mean, one of the Bram's books, Dracula the Undead, the idea that the character itself is immortal. Is that also the connection, the Satan, the devil, the idea that it lives on from generation to generation? And was this totally a novel concept on his part, or was it too based on spiritualism of some sort?
I think it was. There have been scholars that have made their predictions, and they've looked for the term undead, just as you mentioned. That was the original title for Dracula, actually, before we think his editor changed it to Dracula. But the undead, I think, is Bram's investigation into the whole concept of the spirit living on after death. And I have read, again, 26 books that Bram referred to, and he listed them all in his notes, and they're all in the London Library. And he's got theories on dreams. He's got theories on life after death, that where people have actually experienced this. Mm-hmm. He's got books about second sight, premonitions. Mm-hmm. So he was really investigating this possibility about life after death, or how can we prolong life? And if so, is that something tied up, obviously, in the dark side, or is there, any goodness to it? But I think it's pretty obvious what he's trying to sort of direct people, is this was a dark side. And the only way to sort of give Lucy the opportunity to rest in peace is to stake her and basically stop her being a vampire and allow her soul to rest properly, rather than live in this sort of in hell and go and keep taking blood from others to sort of keep her undead.
I just, as a quick follow-up, and a thought just came to mind. I know they were separated by over 50 years, but can one imagine if Houdini and Bram would have worked together? The type of investigation, the type of research they could have done, the type of book they could have co-authored, the type of a show they could have put on, as far as crossing that line, actually, dealing with the very concept, because it sounds like he was, even the notion as far as communicating with the dead, that he was already questioning that 150 years ago.
No, you're right. And he was, as I said a bit earlier, there is some common links in between Houdini and Bram with Arthur Conan Doyle, who Bram and Conan Doyle were very close friends. Bram actually helped one of Conan Doyle's short stories be turned into a play at the Lyceum Theater. Conan Doyle sent Bram a very nice letter congratulating him on Dracula. Mark Twain was a neighbor of Bram Stoker's in Chelsea, and was a big believer in spiritualism. And these guys were very close. And I've seen letters back and forth in the Hartford Twain house, just not talking about spiritualism as much as just sort of jokes and so on. So they were tight. So it was an interesting time, you guys, where people who were free to think would find others to confide in, and I said, sometimes it was behind closed doors. And Bram was a Freemason. I know he attended a few meetings of the Order of the Golden Dawn. Not sure if he ever became a member. He was very close with a fellow by the name of J. Brodie Innes, who was a big wig in Order of the Golden Dawn. Yes, so there was a lot of that. But I also think that Bram was somewhat thwarted to be openly a free thinker, because he was an upstanding conservative manager of a theater that for 27 years, you couldn't afford to be some edgy, looked at as a whack job. But subtly, Bram would introduce these things, paranormal type things into Dracula, the Mystery of the Sea, Lair of the White Worm. These are things he included in his writings.
Now, I have a question playing off of that. So with that, going back to the history of the undead, I loved how you explained as far as the undoing of someone's torture, correct? To release their soul from having to go through that internal hell. And through that journey that he went on, and of course, now that you have gone on with an incredible, your story alone, I could probably listen to, I'm going to be honest, for hours, and I know we don't have that time, but I am curious that through this discovery and natural interest of his own, and for you, this plays for both, during these deep interests of supernatural occurrences, paranormal occurrences, the spiritual plane, the sight, everything that plays into this, did he note anywhere in any of his journals, his logs, his books, of him experiencing anything supernatural or paranormal during his work? And then also for you, has that happened in the uncovering of all of this, and something happening to you that you were like, okay, I'm going to take a step back for a minute. I'll be right back. I'm curious if there's been anything behind that as well.
Well, the answer is yes and yes. And so we'll just go on a little bit, because I know time is limited, but this is something that I think warrants more of my work to look into. And I've actually been writing with a professor from University of North Georgia, a book where I've really dealt, a fictional book, but I've put this into it. His name is Dr. Leverett Butts, and we've written a couple of short stories together. And this one, we're almost finished. It's going through some beta readers, but it is about the summer that Bram Stoker writes the novel Dracula in Cruden Bay, Scotland. And he experiences, Brit, second sight. And where I got this from was in Bram's own personal library. and we've seen the list of the books that were sold by his widow on auction. So I know the book, and I've seen the review. It's the one review I've ever found that Bram did of a book, and it was by a guy from Scotland, and it was about second sight in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. And so I read the review. It was in a New Zealand newspaper, but it was Bram Stoker taking this very seriously and not poo-pooing it, just saying that this guy had some very concrete examples of things that he had experienced, and it's very difficult to fabricate, and so on. So it appeared to me, without Bram going overboard, was agreeing with these things. That's fact number one. And I like to always have two backups. The second one was in a newspaper in Dundee, Scotland. One of the 14 summers that Bram spent in Cruden Bay, Scotland, he met a newspaper writer by the name of Norval Scrimmanger, and Norval went to a cocktail party for Henry Irving that Bram Stoker was there, and he started by saying, I went to this cocktail party to meet the great Sir Henry Irving, and I found his manager to be much more interesting. And he talked about Bram Stoker holding court by a fireplace, smoking a cigar, and telling the people who were in his little circle, and Norval was one of them, about two specific incidences that Bram experienced second sight firsthand.
Wow.
And I won't bore you guys with the details now, but we've included this stuff. Well, I'll give you one of them then in the story. So what he basically said is, I was in the town of Edinburgh visiting some people, and I went to see this lady, and I don't know why she was there. That's all the details I won't give you, but the most important stuff. She was holding her baby, who was sort of 6 months old, and the 3 or 4-year-old was sort of wandering through the small house, kind of going, she won't play with me. She won't play with me. And it was, well, what's the matter? She said, well, she's going to die. And sort of Bram and the lady, who's going to die? What are you talking about? She said, well, she's going to die. And the baby was totally healthy. Didn't have, which, I mean, in those days, there was a lot of mystery ailments that would kill little babies. Nothing wrong whatsoever. 3 days later, the baby just died, unexplained. And this little girl had this premonition that her little sister was going to die. Mm-hmm. And it happened 3 days later. Okay, that could be circumstance, right? But the next one was Bram Stoker went on a shooting party, shooting pheasant, and with this big Earl, and they had a guy they called them gillies, who were either fishing guides or hunting guides that Bram was assigned to. He said, well, how's the Earl? He said, he's not well. The sheet is getting higher. And he didn't know what he was saying. And so they had a good day shooting, and then it came back the next summer, and he was invited, and Bram said, I'd like to go with the same gilly because I think he was wrong. And he had a conversation. He said, the Earl is fine. He goes, aye, the sheet is much higher now.
Oh.
and within a week, the Earl died of a brain aneurysm that was completely undetected. Obviously, no, they didn't. But what he was talking about for your listeners is the sheet, meaning the sheet being pulled up over a dead man. It was getting higher and higher. He was getting closer and closer to death. He was in perfect health. He was a young man. It wasn't, that he had any injuries, but it was just one of these things. And that would have been one of these, or two of them, because it was Dundee, Scotland, second sight premonitions that Bram believed in. He recounted to this newspaper journalist 30 years after the incident. Norval Scrimmanger wrote it in a newspaper, and I found that clipping. And that's the type of thing that Leverett and I are including in the story, because we're kind of thinking that I believe this is something that Bram Stoker believed in. He was a very open-minded man. One of my favorite quotes in Dracula summed this up, Brit, and it was, there are mysteries in life which men can only guess at, which age by age they may solve only in part. And I think he's talking about things like what we can't explain. Mm-hmm. We can't see them. We might not feel it, but it still could be there.
Correct me if I'm wrong, because I've used the quote in reference to my own personal work. The idea that the journalist, it's a journalist or someone's trying to expose the vampire, the Dracula character. And his response is, go ahead, tell the whole world. No one will believe you.
Yeah.
Is that from?
No, you're right. No one will be. The greatest gift of the vampire is that people won't believe you. You know, he makes himself so realistic they won't believe you. So you're right. That's the essence of it. You've got it, Donald. Yeah.
I can only imagine that he had to really spook the church at the time, and that they either saw him as someone to watch, that he was one of the enlightened, or that he was playing with fire, that he was crossing a line that they would just as soon, only they would acknowledge. But they were quick to pull anyone back. Was he perceived as a threat in any way? Did anyone ever try to slow him down or rein him back in that you've been able to demonstrate?
You know, I haven't seen that, but I felt it myself. And it's funny, back in those days, but back in those days, I think that he would have been a threat, or would have been perceived by a threat by some of those very staunch traditional religious leaders that don't want people to even think of the devil or having any sort of power. But when you think about it, and I'm going to give you this little funny anecdote. 2012, the 100th anniversary of Bram's passing, the family gathered with many other fans in Dublin, Ireland, and went to a ceremony, a sort of a celebration in the same church, a Protestant church where Bram was married. And the priest came to me beforehand, actually by email, and said, look, when you come over, could you bring a first edition of Dracula? And I said, yeah, sure, that'd be cool. Yeah. I didn't know exactly what it was for. Now, my son was with me. He was a religion and English literature major at Sewanee College in Tennessee. And we were sort of joking about, I wonder what they want it for. And so we were there with other family members, and we were pulled off in the alcove about half an hour before the procession. And so the priest comes up to me and said, well, have you got the book, Mr. Stoker? And I said, absolutely. I said, what are you going to do with it? He said, well, I thought we'd process up the aisle with the Bible and Dracula. And my son is going, oh, Dad, I don't know if that's a great idea. You know, it's just typical sort of 19-year-old. He's like, Dad, not a good idea.
Not a good idea.
Well, I said, Father, I said, you know, is the building pretty solid? He says, come on, don't be silly. He says, both books are about good and evil, where good wins out at the end. What's the fuss? And so it was like, everything you said, Donald, is like boiled down to that one little sentence by this Irish Church of Ireland priest who could just say both books are about good and evil, where good wins out at the end. And he's so true. And so they had the procession with the choir and the candles and one guy carrying Dracula, and they're both sitting at the altar. And I have this photograph thinking, okay, there wasn't lightning, there was nothing happening. It was all cool.
But what an honor! I mean, and to essentially not put them on the same level, but the idea that you cannot acknowledge good without acknowledging
the evil,
the opposite.
Exactly.
The evil,
exactly. Yeah.
And you can't have one without the other. It's just that simple.
I mean, you guys get it. I mean, listen, when you talk about a podcast that's discussing things that don't have explanation, or maybe explanation that people understand in present terms, this is exactly what the novel Dracula was about. Van Helsing was, and this is Bram talking, trying to explain to a cross-section of society. At the time, you had a young solicitor, his fiancée wife was a school teacher, you had a high society young lady in Lucy, you had Lord Godalming, who was high society, you had a doctor. the scientist, you had the American cowboy who was the new world. And yet throughout half the novel, they're trying to explain, Van Helsing is trying to use both the scientific method to explain by using proof, which I'm sure you guys wrestle with a lot, as well as things like Brit, you were talking about, just being open-minded. And just because you can't prove something doesn't mean it's there. How do you explain, Dr. Seward, that all this blood we've been giving Lucy every night with transfusion, and the next day she has no blood in her, but there's no pool of blood lying in the bed or on the floor? It's got to go somewhere, right? And he can't explain it. And that's when they begin to open their mind to realize there are more things than heaven and earth that are dreamt of in your philosophy, right out of Hamlet.
Yep, exactly.
Good quote. Good quote. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
If I may quickly, the whole idea of even drinking the blood that came at the time when they did a lot of bloodletting, correct? That
was
done for medicinal purposes.
Yeah.
And he would have witnessed that. And for either the preservation of the ill, or it, like they would suggest in the case like George Washington, that for a very common cold that they essentially bled him to death, that they just kept, bloodletting until he was so weakened that it was to his demise at that age. So is that where even that element?
I think that has a big part in this. And I don't have proof, but I believe by my investigations that Bram's, one of his uncles, who was a famous bloodletting doctor, I've read the treatise that I found that he wrote, and Bram was mysteriously ill for 7 years, that he himself was bloodlet. And when you look at chapter 3, where Jonathan Harker finds Count Dracula in this sort of crypt, and he goes to try to kill him, but he messes up with the shovel, and he says he lay there like a filthy leech, bloated in his repletion. I think that was Bram recounting himself being leeched, because they leeched you or they cut you to get the blood out.
Right.
And so when you think of this almost like reverse science, the people in the day thought that taking the blood out was removing not just the good blood, but the bad humors, the different things that came with you. And then you were so far depleted of all this, then they rehydrated you with oil and claret, red wine, to kill the alcohol killing stuff. And then somehow, luckily, your body would, if you survived, would start producing more blood. But the concept being the blood is the life, when the body is dead and it's devoid of blood, it's dead. But when there's blood in it, there is life. So that's the concept of the dead body or the undead coming out, taking blood from living, that produces life. So the whole idea of sucking blood and is like taking communion, taking the blood of Christ or taking the blood of living people to get the dead person reanimated again.
And
I think that's
immortality, so to speak.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
My goodness gracious. Again, I could literally listen to this I'm serious. Like, this has just been so extremely fascinating and eye-opening to where I want to go back and read the book again. But one of my last questions, because of, I love history, always have, always will, but I have to ask you, coming from, like you were saying, being a coach and everything else, then you dove into this. When you did your journey of going to these locations, I have to know, what was your first take stepping foot on what was the Dracula castle, in a sense of being around the ruins of it, just to stand there and go, wow, this is what stemmed that idea, this character, this whole, idea. I'm just curious what sensation you got from that, because I can imagine, for me, when I see historical pieces or being in Ireland and seeing the historical castles, it's really amazing. But to be a part of that history in some way through your family, what was that like for you?
There were a few times in this journey, Brit, and I now realize you asked this question a little bit earlier. Did I ever actually feel something? Hair in the back of my neck, that sort of presence. When I got to the top of Mount Israel, after following the coordinates that Bram left in his notes in Philadelphia, with my son in terrible weather and a couple of guys, it was more of relief because it was one heck of a day hike and there was fog. And I was more scared and relieved to finally reach this place. But I'd say there were more aha moments, Brit, when I was in funky, cool museums like Marsh's Library in Dublin that has a history of being haunted.
Yeah.
And I challenge your listeners, go and check out why it's haunted. It's a very cool story. I'm not going to spoil it to you, but I felt something happened to me there. I was giving a presentation and it's downstairs. There's 3 levels and I'm down the bottom and they said, Dacre, go set up down there. I've been down there many times before. We've got the chairs set up for you. Set up your computer and, we'll be down in 20 minutes to sort of check on you. And I knew where it was. And I went down. It was one of these type places that's very energy efficient and it has sensors that the lights only turn on when you get close to it, right? So it stays electricity. So I'm walking down, light goes on, go a little farther, light goes on. And then I get to this a little farther, the light didn't go on. So I'm thinking, okay, damn light bulb, but I can't see anything. I can't really see. So I take up my phone and get the little flashlight on. And it feels like ridiculously cold right then. I'm going, shit, what is that? What's going on? And no light. So I got my little flashlight going, okay, it still could be nothing. Just move on, Dacre. Keep moving. The next one will come on down this long hall. And I get into the room and I have to go and manually now mess with the switch, get the light on. Light comes on. And so I plug my computer in. And I see that what was really strange was there's no battery, that the battery level was down. And I had just been working on it 20 minutes earlier back in the place I was staying to get the press, which was full of juice. And I'm now here and it's like, no battery. That's weird. And so luckily I brought my extra battery with me and I plugged the thing in. It was dead. This is the charger. I mean, not a battery, just the plug to go in the, and even though I had all the right plugs, for the adapters, nothing. And it still felt colder than normal. And finally and I was thinking, okay, what is going on? And there is a story of a female ghost in this place. But I was also wondering, Bram Stoker, we know he came into this Marsh's Library and did his research at least 6 times. We know what he signed in the book. And thinking, is he telling me he doesn't want his story told? Mm-hmm. Is there something to this? And the guys came down, the 2 of them, keeper of the books and his assistant. And, I say, hey guys, thanks for the light bulb. They go, what do you mean? All the lights were on. So they didn't experience that light bulb not going on the way I did.
Wow.
And I thought, well, okay, there's always a chance that I didn't walk just close to the sensor, but there was still no explanation for the battery on the laptop to be dead and it not charging. So we were able to get another charger. The presentation went great. I go back to my condo that night thinking, oh man, am I going to have to go and buy, is there a hard drive? What is it? Everything was fine.
Wow.
It was totally fine. So yes, along the way, there had been some of these little things, unexplained happenings that I'm just thinking, well, maybe there is some connection to Uncle Bram or somebody along the way that either wants me to or doesn't want me to do things, or you just touched something that is unexplained. And that's cool,
Which was going to be my last question. I mean, have you, throughout the course of your research and your travels and actually going to the very landmarks involved, have you felt the presence? Have you at times felt that you were being guided, influenced in any way? You just described this particular situation.
Right.
But you see this as being your life's mission to carry on not only the story, and as a result, do you believe that he would be amazed to see that it not only will outlive all of us here this evening, but it has a life of its own, that no matter how often that stake is driven through the heart, it always comes back. It always comes back.
Well, I look back at times when I found things. And when I found, the notes in the Philadelphia Museum, and I found a particular page that nobody had recognized, or a buddy of mine in Germany found some coordinates and he contacted me and we looked, and for some reason I said, Hans, this isn't right. Let's invert those numbers. And then I found one of the maps, and I didn't know I'd purchased some of those maps, some of the books from the London Library. I got them from A Books. I didn't know it came with a map in it. Turned out that it's exactly the same map that Bram used to write those coordinates. And when we decided, Hans and I, to flip them around, boom, there's the Borgo Pass, and there's this mountain that's an extinct volcano. That's where he put his Castle Dracula. So I think I was guided,
yes,
Don, at certain times, not physically on the ground in Transylvania or in Whitby or in Cruden Bay, Scotland, but I think I was guided, or things happened because I positioned myself well, that I was guided to find the right documents. I found in a box of books that my cousins, Bram's great-grandson, said, here, Dacre, we don't understand what these things are. The handwriting is so terrible. I leafed through it, and I was in the right place at the right time, or I was guided. I found Bram's journal,
in other words,
from when he was a university student, and that gave me more information to go somewhere else.
Exactly. That's the entire investigative process, but the idea, don't quit right now. Go that one extra step.
That's right. That's right. What got me there? What was it? And sometimes it's good planning, it's luck, or there's somebody just nudging you along a little way and say, here, Dacre, take it from here.
Well, and thankfully you have taken those little inspirations as an appropriate action. And it's always, and probably more times than not, turned out to be the correct decision. So
well, and it's guys like you, though, that help spread the word, right? I mean, I could be doing this and sell a few books, give a couple lectures, but when I get a chance to talk with people like you guys who experience these type of things yourselves and have other listeners that do, it becomes bigger, becomes more realistic, and you're allowed to share the word. And I'm sure if anything that I just said tonight stimulates somebody to look into their family's history, or look into, what went behind the scenes and writing with some of their favorite books. I get people that have read Dracula 2 and 3 and 4 times and say, my gosh, what you just told me tonight at the end of this presentation, I had no idea that this is when I'm going to go read that whole thing again, it's going to take on a different light. Then I feel I have, fulfilled some of my destiny to help bring Bram's literary legacy, keep it alive, as you say, keep that stake, keep that stake going to, another generation, keep it alive, or undead as it may be.
And that's a good point, because I think it's one thing to read a book and admire an author's work. It's one thing, but it's another when you can hear the legacy and the journey in which that author took. And then when you can hear it from the family and how the family discovered so much to their own history, it really you take a step back and admire the work tenfold, but then you also look at the book differently the next time you read it. And I think that's really powerful.
Yeah. And it's exciting, and then, I write a sequel to the book, I write a prequel. With all of this cool research that I've done, you bring it to the masses through fiction. And then there's also, the documentaries I'm on and the presentations to give it to them, in easy to digest ways to say, hey, look, there's just cool other little things to look at, these mysteries, and there may be more, and maybe somebody's going to find some out and share them with me, and I'll help pass them on as well.
Well, and you've been wise in that. I know your presentation is called Stoker on Stoker, and you do tours such as in Transylvania, and without allowing someone else to exploit the name and the story, who better than an actual descendant? And so that's why we applaud you for, and who better to carry on the name and the very legend itself.
Well, thank you. I take it fairly seriously. I like to separate some of the, fact from fiction. Fiction is cool, but sometimes some of the biographers just take too many leaps of faith just to sell a book or two.
Truth is often more strange than fiction. So
absolutely, you guys know that, both of you do. So yeah, thank you for recognizing that. Absolutely.
Well, we appreciated having you on the show tonight, but before we do say our goodbyes, I would really love the listeners to know where they can interact with you or what you have that's coming up. I mean, obviously you've mentioned your book now, but other things and other ways to maybe see you, a lecture, things like that. Feel free to share that so that they can reach out.
Sure. So I do Facebook, Dacre Stoker author, and Instagram, and I do my best to respond there. I post on Facebook where I'm going to be, sort of every couple of months. DacreStoker.com is a website. I don't keep it up to date as much as I should, but my wife and I also produce the Bram Stoker Estate.com website where we sell books, and we write, we take other people want us to put things on a website that they've discovered about Bram or any of the other family members. So it's sort of a clearinghouse for things within the estate, not just Bram.
Good idea.
I'll tell you one thing that I do have coming out that's very interesting as far as being unique. It is a NFT version of Dracula, which is a unique edition. Only 666 will be coming out this coming Halloween. Electronic versions of Dracula.
Wow.
Where I have enhanced that by doing 164 videos from where I go all over the world, castles and mountains and so on, that are in the story. And I've also working with the Rosenbach Museum of Philadelphia to include 45 pages of Bram Stoker's notes that are inserted into the chapters. And I write little notes of how this is relevant to the chapter. And then also these NFT versions, which are, unique, you buy it, this is only yours, has a sort of a 2-year agreement where every month I give more things to it. So there's more things added to the book. And then at the end of whenever you're tired of it, you can resell it on the website. Hopefully the price goes up. So it'll only be $33 for any one of the 666 books, but the value, like other NFTs, may go up and up and up over time. So that's something that's coming out. Is I think tech is kind of cool, and even though I put a lot of time and energy, I haven't had to put a lot of money into it. So if it doesn't go, it doesn't go. But it is something cool for authors, in that when somebody resells the book, there is a small commission that goes to the publisher and the author. So I actually make a little bit of money on resales, which is unusual for an author, because once you normally sell one book, it's gone. So that's coming out in October. There'll be more info about that on Facebook and Instagram.
You may set the course for the rest of us authors that we jump on board with that same process. I like the idea.
Why not? Because it also gives you the opportunity. I mean, they've asked me, Dacre, what would be one of your books to come out? But just think of the stuff you guys write and give the opportunity to do either voiceovers or videos that they attach as an appendix, where you get to say where you got the inspiration, what experiences you had writing the book. That becomes like when you buy a CD, you get those little special discs that have some of the making of. This is the same thing that us authors should be able to do, because some of those backstories are very cool.
The making of, and the idea that in television, where years back they didn't get residuals on all the reruns, and we should have all learned our lessons by that, because as long as the work is still available, the originator needs to get a share.
Just a little bit. So Book Vaults in England is the publisher starting this stuff off for books. So check out Book Vaults. I know they have a holding page for what I'm doing, but any other authors out there, you go send them an email saying, look, I got a cool book with a great story, and they may be interested in, I know they're just getting started with all this, but that could be a good entree, because I believe, Don, you're right. We should, authors should get a little bit.
And Brit knows me well enough. I'm always coming up with new ideas for new books. So
there you go.
He definitely might be heading over to that website at some point.
Yes, I think I will.
Good.
Thank you.
I have to say, Dacre, it was wonderful having you on. It was a pleasure hearing everything that you've shared. Actually, to be honest, I would love to have you back. I know Don would agree, just so we can dive deeper into more different areas that we didn't touch on tonight. It's fascinating.
I would like to get more into the contemporary, and as far as the whole the vampire, as far as imagery, as far as how it has evolved, where we are today, and the fact that it has gone through evolutions, and what has inspired that, and who have been the people behind that. And so that'll be part 2.
Well, let's talk about that. I've got a pretty busy travel schedule. Next week going to England, and then in June going to Transylvania with actually Vincent Price's daughter Victoria. We're leading a tour with Experience Transylvania is the tour company. So when we come back, let's chat about possibilities of another show and other cool things we can discuss.
With another whole suitcase full of experiences and new people. So sounds great.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys very much. And to your listeners, be safe. And again, the blood is the life.
Yes. Very good.
That is where it's at. And then of course, on the next note, we will also talk about sparkling vampires, as I would love to hear your take.
Take us home, Brit.
So on that note, everyone, thank you again for listening in to No Earthly Explanation. This was a fabulous show, and I'm glad that you took the time to listen. You can find us anywhere you like to listen, whether that's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio. I can name them all. We're there. That No Earthly Explanation is the key tag. Make sure you type that in. You can email us if you have any guest requests or information that you may want to share, or maybe you just have a question for us at noearthlyexplanation@gmail.com. We are on Facebook as No Earthly Explanation, or you can find us individually as hosts. I am Brit Barbieri, so you can find me on Facebook as Brit Barbieri Official, or you can find me on Brit_investigates on Instagram. And then for my wonderful partner in crime, my co-host, Donald Schmidt, you can find him on Instagram and on Facebook. On Instagram, he is Don47Tom. And then on Facebook, it is Donald Raymond Schmidt, and that is RAYMOND. And again, thank you everyone for taking the time to listen. We love you guys. We appreciate it. And until next time, I'm going to go jump on my unicorn and head out of here.
Good night, Brit. Wonderful being with you. And our guest was just phenomenal tonight. I can't wait for part 2. Bye-bye, all.
A quest is a search for something. And every week, the Quest podcast will show you how we know what we know through interviews with people that have incredible stories of dedication and perseverance. I'm your host, Todd Fisher. Join me in this thought-provoking and inspiring podcast of discovery. Find us anywhere you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please be sure to rate and review this episode. This podcast is produced by Todd Fisher and Anthony Smith and is distributed by Metacortex Publishing. This podcast is copyright. Any previously trademarked or copyright content is used by permission. Information and opinions stated in this podcast should not be construed as medical advice. Please be sure and visit the official website for Metacortex Publishing at metacortexpublishing.com or find us on social media for other unique content.